I just wanted to start by explaining why we started the Bear and the Butterfly. It is a part of a bigger project that we call the Consider Project. I was a CPA, an accountant, graduated from University of Washington, and in 2007, my older sister was killed in a bicycling accident, at which time I got a phone call from my father. She was killed instantly. And sitting in the back of an alley, I received a message, and the message was, ask people to consider. And so I shared that message at her memorial service, and we started, this was over 10 years ago, a series of concerts, benefit concerts for the Evanger Rainey Foundation we called the Consider Concerts. And then I took some break. I went back to school to study theology and seminary. I started asking big questions about life, and eventually I became a pastor, so I'm also a pastor as well as the founder of the Consider Project. And now we are restarting something that has been going for quite some time, since 2007, and we're finding new, exciting ways to just have big conversation, to consider well together as a community. And this is sort of the first reiteration of the Consider Project. And so we're really excited about this. We're still learning, but we want to have more events like this, events where we can come together in a city like ours and ask big questions and talk about important things, matters of great concern. And so we want to talk about them from a full array of positions. And so one of the cool things that we believe about considering, so we're actually putting together a website right now, and a friend of ours who does this sort of thing asked, what are the 5 words that explain the Consider Project? And so I just want to share those because I think they're informative to what we are creating. I want to invite you guys to be a part of creating this kind of community, this kind of free, open space in our city where we can talk about these things. And the first word was fun. That was the first word. Tyler and I were friends before we started doing this together. And we think getting together and considering big things is fun. It's not stuffy, it's not boring, it's actually quite fun. In fact, we have this human capacity to consider transcendent things, deep things, true things, real things, beautiful things. And when you actually exercise that muscle, what we hope that you find and what we found is that it's actually quite fun. It's actually quite fun. I like to use the analogy of running. You know, I've got 2 little boys, a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old, and I remember the first time I saw my older boy run for the first time. You start to walk, and you're like, this is pretty amazing, but then when you realize that you can run, just the joy of having both of your feet off the ground at the same time. That's actually the definition of running, if you've ever watched Speed Walking Olympics. To have both feet off the ground. That, to me, is what considering is. It's fun. It's joyful. And a lot of people are living their whole life just walking, and we want to help people to run and think with their whole minds. But it's a muscle you have to exercise. It's hard to run if you haven't done it in a while. And so that's part of why we get together, is to have fun and exercise those muscles. The other word that comes to mind is more. There is more to life than many of us experience. There's more to the life of the mind, the life of the heart and the soul than most people get to experience. And that is, maybe they're not invited into these kinds of conversations or this kind of community. So we want you to experience more, not only deep things, but just more in the way of community and connection and all these amazing parts of life. The third word that comes to mind is freedom. And so one of the ways that we talk about that at the Consider Project is, first, we want this space to be a space of freedom, that there is nothing off limits, there is no category of thought, experiment that you cannot engage in. Sometimes you might feel that way in your job or at your family dinner table, that you're not allowed to bring up categories, for instance, maybe like faith, or maybe like science, or maybe like bioethics. And we're going to talk about all of them together, but there's freedom here, and we want to be promoters of freedom, because we think where there's freedom, there's great consideration, and great consideration leads to truth, and truth leads to the common good, and so we want to be a place of freedom. But we don't just want that for ourselves. We want that for all people in all places at all times, and that's sort of the grand vision of the Consider Project. So every dollar that you've donated for your ticket here will go directly to through the Evanger Foundation and to an organization that we believe is working for freedom in some way around the world. Because if you do not have freedom, if you are enslaved, if you do not have the freedom of knowing where your next meal is coming from, if you are enslaved by thirst or hunger or your borders, you cannot have the space and the freedom necessary to truly consider well. And so each and every Consider event, we will give 100% of everything that we raise away, and we'll pick one charity that we believe in. And so tonight, all the money that we've raised up will go to the International Justice Mission, which is working against human trafficking and slavery around the world. On your note sheet, you can see a little description of the International Justice Mission, and just know, here's what we believe. When we get together, when we exercise this privilege and this freedom that we have to consider, that we should also be considering others and hope to pass that on to somebody else in the world that doesn't have the freedom to consider. We believe it to be a basic human right, and we know not everybody has it. So that's the Consider Project. Every event we do, whether it is a concert or it's a Bear and the Butterfly, and we'll just keep adding to the banquet of places where we can consider well. The last two are curiosity, self-explanatory. Be curious and ask good questions. And one of the ways we'll do that tonight, we'll have a few Q&A times. And there's 3 cards. They don't say what they are. They're just the event logo. Those are question cards. We want you to write a question, and we'll stop twice throughout the night. And this is a public conversation. We want you to engage with us. And we'll have some fun ways of pulling your engagement out. We have a little bingo machine, and so you have a number on your card, and you don't have to participate if you don't want, but just we want you to know that you are a considerer. You're not just a consumer, but you have ideas and thoughts, and one of the great ways to start considering well is to ask great questions, okay? And then the final word is connect. You could go listen to a great podcast on bioethics and faith and science. There's lots of them out there. But there is nothing like being in a room with other human beings that you can connect to. And that, I think, is a missing piece. We have access to so much information in our world, and we should be thankful for that. I was thankful for that preparing for this. But there is nothing like getting together to consider. There's nothing like connecting. And so we want to create a community for people that really do want to connect and consider well together. So that's the Consider Project, and the Bear and the Butterfly forums are a part of that, and so we're so glad that you're here. Thank you for helping us start something new and hopefully exciting and fun in our city, and I would love to have you continue to participate in these. But now let's get into it, and I want to invite our distinguished guest. Can I call you distinguished?
You can call me whatever you want.
Okay, I'll call you distinguished. This is Dr. Tyler Tate. He is a pediatric palliative care physician, an assistant professor of pediatrics, and he holds the Miles J. Edwards Endowed Chair of Medical Ethics at Oregon Health and Science University. Used to live in Seattle, now lives in Portland, but we still love him dearly. And Tyler, would you just tell us your story? In particular, would you just tell us how did you get into bioethics as a profession? And tell us a little bit about the ups and downs of your own life when it comes to how faith and science have interacted over the years.
I'd be happy to. Thank you guys all for coming out on Sunday night. I know it's already late, and I'm grateful that you guys are all here. It's interesting to come here because there's a sense where I feel like I sort of am a fraud because many of you guys are my good friends who kind of grew up with me, and now I'm, as Dave said, faculty at OHSU and have a neat position where I get to really do ethics and write and publish in these different domains. So I sometimes am just as surprised, how did I get to where I am? So I'll try and describe that briefly. And the stories of my faith and religion are intertwined with the story of just who I am and why I'm here. So those will sort of be presented together. But I grew up in a Christian home and in a sort of tradition, a very charismatic sort of tradition. And as many people do, go to college and then start having to face some major questions about who we are, how do I trust my senses to deliver knowledge, and what are the different kinds of knowledge. So I was a pre-med student, and as some of you know, when you're a pre-med student, you have to be very grade conscious, as I was, but I somehow got duped into taking a philosophy course when I was a freshman. Logic, which seemed safe, but it was not. And through learning about some of the Enlightenment thinkers, in particular a guy named Immanuel Kant, I realized that my beliefs in God were very different than my beliefs in, say, the fact that I had a black Labrador retriever named Jack, or that I believed that my mom loved me. But my belief in a story that happened thousands of years ago and was written down in a book that has been edited multiple times was a different kind of belief. And I don't know if any of you have had this sort of sudden recognition that there's an instability to faith. And this was quite unnerving. But what I did was I pressed in because I thought, wow, this is a really fascinating sort of set of questions. And so I ended up double majoring in molecular biology and philosophy and kind of pushing the boundaries of those questions. But I will tell you the truth, I am still living in the exhaust fumes of those questions, meaning I have not answered them. And I have lots of doubts and I have lots of faith, and they're intermingled in a way that is both tragic and beautiful, and have sort of inspired me to be where I am today. But I ultimately went into pediatrics and went to medical school in Alabama, at University of Alabama, and then came out here to University of Washington to do my residency in pediatrics and got interested in ethics re-interested in ethics, I should say, through some mentorship at UW, and then ultimately went and got a master's degree in bioethics and did a palliative care fellowship at Duke University because I found that Duke was a place where the Divinity School and the School of Medicine, there was a lot of cross-examination and sort of a real way where religion, science, medicine were being seen as sort of co-collaborators in a really beautiful and rich story. So, and then I missed the mountains and snowboarding, so I got a sweet job back at OHSU, and I came back. It's not UW, you know, it's Portland. It's a great time. So, you know, I think in terms of bioethics, it's a really kind of amorphous idea. What is that? What does it mean? And how do these different domains sort of circulate with each other? You know, my mom is a special ed teacher. And in particular, she works with kids who are have severe cognitive disability and are deaf and blind. So I grew up hanging out with those kids. If you grew up hanging out with kids who are sort of the most radically vulnerable population in the world, you learn what radical dependency is, right? And those kids, from a long time ago, from when I was a kid, reminded me and continue to remind me that the idea that self-actualization and preference satisfaction, which is one of the major worlds of ethics called utilitarianism, which maybe we'll get into, where the right decision, the right way to live, and the right way to build society is where autonomous, rational individuals can maximize their preferences. Well, these kids sort of were a constant reminder that they didn't really fit into that algorithm. What about someone who can't talk or even perhaps think? And the best they can do, you know, working at Seattle, I know a lot of my nurse friends here, a baby with virtually no brain, the best they can do is lay there and receive love. But is that not morally important? So those questions really kind of haunted me, and as I did my pediatrics and saw what those kind of lives are like, made me realize, man, I want to critically think about how we can live together and commit ourselves to create a flourishing community that does not, from the outset, not include people who are really unlike sort of the model that a lot of ethics is built around. So those questions and that story has really motivated me to continue to ask questions, and then I have found religion and science and ethics to actually be easy bed partners, which is not always sort of as they were described. And now, in my new position, I have the opportunity to really kind of be a leader in how those worlds act to each other.
Yeah. Thank you, Tyler. Yeah, we're so glad that you're here. Thanks for coming up from Portland and being with us. And, we've got to have lots of these conversations over the years. And I think the question, just to start with, why is this worth our time? Why is it worth the time to talk about where is the intersection, or is there an intersection, or can science, faith, and bioethics come together for human flourishing and for the common good? That's sort of why we're here. We think that they can, but they haven't always. And so just this week I was listening to a podcast that reminded us of that, and I never knew about this, but in the 1960s, a majority of phase 1 medical pharmaceutical research was done on inmates. And nobody really batted an eye. People knew about it. They just thought, well, it has to be done on someone. And it got a bit out of hand. I mean, there's many stories from this. You can look up these articles. One, I think, that finally caught the attention of much of the American public was, and having a young child, I know this, tear-free shampoo. Well, how did they find out it was tear-free? Well, they were going into and paying inmates to allow them to do the research, and they would literally hold their eyes open and drop soap into their eyes to see what would happen. And lots of stories injecting inmates with diseases, hepatitis, and some other things. And eventually they said, we need to stop this. But that for so long it went on. Why is that? And can we, if we're allowing all the information and knowledge to come together, can we stop those sorts of things from happening as well? So I don't know. Why is this conversation important to you?
I at some point in the night I'm going to get up and just start preaching, but not yet. I get very passionate about these things because they're really important. At some point, maybe a question will be, what do we mean when we talk about what is religion, what is science, and what is bioethics? Well, I'll start with the third and say briefly, bioethics is a response to the questions Dave just raised, okay? And a really important thing, the old adage from Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living, right? Why do we want to consider questions? Because, guess what? We are oftentimes immune to or unaware of the wrong things that are being committed around us. We become sort of unaware. It's sort of like a fish, right? The old story of the fish swimming around in water has no sense that there is land because all it knows is water, right? This is why some of our most egregious things that humankind has done, let's look at slavery. Why was it that so few people were crying out against slavery? It's because they lived in a world where they were handed norms, and those norms were unquestioned, and they did not even recognize that there was sort of these egregious things happening around them. So bioethics as a field and as a set of questions emerged out of World War II primarily. So the Nazis, Dave and I were talking about this before, we're like, you never want to bring up the Nazis. There's actually a law in philosophy. Once you bring the Nazis into the argument is over because it is always the trump card. But that is not what we're doing. So they did a lot of experiments on disabled people. They had a whole sterilization program for people who were, as they were called then, mentally retarded. And once the war ended, there was something called the Nuremberg trials where the whole world suddenly went in and saw what was happening. I mean, and that's not even to mention all of the, the most egregious, horrible things such as the extermination of the Jewish people that we all recognize. And people for the first time sort of started realizing or asking the question, can we do whatever we want to people who can't sort of give their consent? Can we just do an experiment on a prisoner? Can we just do an experiment on a disabled child? And our public consciousness, thank God, started recognizing, no, actually we cannot. And these questions started percolating in the United States in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. People started asking these same kind of questions. So in Alabama, there was these famous trial and horrible experiments that people were doing on African-American men where they were giving them syphilis and then not telling them, and then watching how it killed them over a course of years. There's a really famous, sort of infamous experiment that a man did at an orphanage called Willowbrook, where he gave all of these disabled children hepatitis and then watched what would happen to them. And no one was questioning these things. In fact, they were applauding them because they said, well, how else are we going to acquire this knowledge, right? So knowledge was, in a sense, being worshipped as sort of the ultimate goal. Knowledge, scientific progress, these mythologies that were sort of structuring how we thought about what is good, what is right. And out of that series of recognitions that we can't just do whatever we want to powerless people, emerged this field called bioethics, which just is, bio, life, and ethics, sort of morality, right and wrong. And that sort of engine started kind of driving us into where we are today. That's just a super brief history. But the point that I want you guys to sort of chew on is that, is to ask yourself, what are you comfortable with today? What am I comfortable with today that in 50 years or 100 years will be looked back upon like the Willowbrook injecting children with hepatitis that everyone was applauding? There are many examples of this. And things just sort of go on. And to me, that's the real being woke, is to recognize that I'm given a series of norms, and unchallenged, I may be being baptized into some really bad things, unless I look critically at what I am doing and the actions I'm committing. And that's ethics.
Yeah. Well, and so the thesis, or where we're going to be moving today, is this, that we both agree that the more streams of knowledge and wisdom we can bring into the discussion of bioethics, or ethics in general, but particularly in bioethics, the better chance we have as a community and a society to reach bioethical standards and norms that lead to human flourishing and the common good, and we don't get caught up in these blind spots and traps of thinking. And you say, of course. You say, of course, right? Of course, we all agree on that we should, as much knowledge and wisdom and as many streams as we can bring together, yes, let's do that, and that must be what we're doing, of course, right? And the answer is, unfortunately, no. There is, as I said, not freedom to bring in knowledge and wisdom from every source. And so I've heard Tyler talk about this as a bioethicist and as a pediatrician. And so why don't you, is that true? What I'm saying is that all streams of knowledge and wisdom are not invited into a lot of these conversations?
Yeah. I mean, I think, from the title of this talk, bioethics, science, religion, the fact Dave's a pastor, that sort of one of the major things we want to discuss and think through together, right? Because I really do. I'm super excited for the questions. Hope you guys are thinking about them. Do I have plants? No. I don't. I did tell Joe. These sort of ideas oftentimes get siloed away from each other. I am lived in the Pacific Northwest most of the last decade, and I work in secular universities, and it's difficult to have the domains of religion and faith, science, and the scientific method, right? Hypothesis testing, and sort of ethics, all talk to each other. And the question is, do they inform each other? And how do they? And why is there this sort of common sort of idea in our culture that they have to be separated, that there are barriers between thinking about God and thinking about testing a scientific hypothesis? So I think I'll say a few words about this sort of history.
Yeah.
Yes?
Well, the question is...
I'm right, getting off track.
No, you're doing a great job. The question, though, we're saying is, well, why not?
Yeah.
Why not? And I think we do need to look at the history of the relationship between science and faith and understand the real history to start to understand why today, particularly in a city like Seattle, for instance, there is this divide. And I would just say from a historical perspective, a perspective of from Christianity at least, well, what we realize is that science and faith have not always been in tension, that they've not been kept in separate rooms, and they always were working together. If you study faith and science, particularly the Christian faith, you realize that science really came from a Christian understanding of the world, which said that there is a rational God who has created a rational planet and human beings, and he's given them rational minds so that they might understand the creation and use the creation and mold it in such a way as to bring the most potential benefit to the most potential people. That has always been a Christian understanding, and so science and faith have not been at odds. In fact, thanks to the church and Christianity, we have a lot of modern medicine and hospitals and those sorts of things. And those, you can look those things up and read about the history of those things. But it's only maybe been in the last 100 years that we've thought about this tension or this either or of science and faith. And so I'd just love to hear you talk a little bit more about why you think that tension exists from a historical perspective. And then we'll start to ask the question of where do we go from here?
Yeah. Thanks. I think, and to note that I think we'll talk. I'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes, kind of about how Jewish thought, Christian thought, conceptualize a world that is ordered and that there are laws that are discoverable. Which was the milieu out of which science really emerged. But just, I think, as we were talking about this, kind of pulling this down in my own life, I have struggled and continue to struggle with understanding how science responds to religious belief and vice versa. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you kind of open your ears to how these worlds are discussed or thought about, especially in a place like the Pacific Northwest, it is seen sort of as enemies, right? That's the kind of cultural kind of motif that we oftentimes hear. And so why is that? Well, what is most often pointed to? I do think a brief sort of historical reflection on science and religion and then science and ethics and religion and ethics is helpful. So you have the Enlightenment, right? So the Enlightenment was this period in the 1600s, 1700s, where people sort of, the story goes, threw off the shackles of religious belief. And the Catholic Church in Europe, and a major part of that story is a story of removing the earth from the center of the universe and replacing it with the sun, right? That's Nikolai Copernicus and the Copernican revolution. And then you hear about Galileo, who took Copernicus's ideas and started sort of preaching them to Europe. And what happened to Galileo? We hear, right? Shut down by the Catholic Church. Persecuted and shut down. And then we move, so as I see it, that's kind of one major step in, and I'm not saying for or against right now, I'm sort of just presenting how we think about it, right? That was sort of step one. The earth was dethroned by the sun. What was step two? Sort of, I think it was in the 19th century, Charles Darwin did what Copernicus and Galileo did to the earth with the human person. So we took the human person, which had always been considered to be created by God in some way, and replaced that with an animal, an evolved animal that is the result of several billion years of struggle and killing and evolution. And now we have this creature. And then I think today, and we see this especially in a place like Seattle, where we have the Paul Allen Brain Institute, we have University of Washington doing incredible neuroscientific work. What is the sort of the last holdout of religious sort of belief, createdness? It's consciousness. It's human consciousness. It's freedom of the will. It is the emotions actually pointing towards something real. But what is sort of the story? What's the narrative today? It's that just like the earth was dethroned, the human body was dethroned from its sacredness, and now we have the mind, the last frontier. And what do we see in ethics? Ethics is an interesting thing. We see another kind of, I would say, another story of tyranny, which is the story that in the old days, where did ethics come from? At least, pre-Enlightenment. Ethics came from God. God, in the Judeo-Christian story, revealed how human beings ought to behave. And in the Ten Commandments, in the Torah, in the laws of the Hebrew Bible, and in sort of Jesus Christ's teachings to the Christian church. And then we knew what to do because a book told us to. But in the Enlightenment, people sort of supplanted that with human reason. And out of that emerged a new story, a story that said we don't need to be told what to do. We can discover it for ourselves. We can think our way into right and wrong. And so out of that, you have blooming these various thinkers who, in various traditions, have attempted to secure a morality external to the human body, so something that actually is objective out there, but does not need to point in any way, shape, or form to human life and morality being created. But instead, it is created. Well, there's a new creator. It's us. So those are sort of, as I see them, four major reasons, historical narratives, that will lead a lot of people, myself included, to think and question, not just do we need religion, but actually quite to the contrary, should we escape from religious belief and religious convictions in order to achieve something better? And is religion, in fact, a danger to our scientific progress and morality as a whole? So I think those are sort of the stories as I see them. And again, I'm not judging them for or against. I think those are really the stories that we live in. That is the narrative that we dwell in here in this particular time and place, Seattle, Washington, 2019.
Yeah. So it sort of brings us to the present moment. That's sort of the history of how we got here. And then the question that we have to ask, and I think we should ask and continue to wrestle with, is, has science progressed in such a way that we don't need these other streams?
Yeah, what do we think about that? What do we think about those stories?
Where is the science at? And I'm just a lowly pastor here, but but I think the question of love is a helpful category to think through. Have we understood the mind and neuroscience in such a way that we understand love? And that for me is a helpful one. I remember a conversation I had with a friend. We were discussing love, and he defined it as an economic exchange. And I've always thought about that. I've wrestled with that.
What did he mean by that, you think?
That it was nothing more than human beings involved in economics with one another, and as soon as that economic exchange was not beneficial, then love cease to exist. And that was sort of, this is a friend that I love dearly, and I don't think love can be answered with science or economics alone. I think love is something more than that, but what say you? What say you?
Right. So, and we're going to be doing our first question and answer session in 5 or 7 minutes. So think about some of the things we've said. Because again, like, I don't think I have the answers here. I think that, there's 2 people that I really like to read. One is a theologian named Stanley Hauerwas. The other is a philosopher named Stanley Cavell. They both have named Stanley. I'm going to name my child Stanley if I ever have one. But with their own respective fields, Cavell says the work of philosophy is never complete. Hauerwas says something similar. He says the work of theology is never complete, right? So what does that mean? It means, guess what it means? It means more. It means what the Consider Project is all about. It means that we are always seeking the next answer to the next question. Philosophically speaking, there's the fancy word of dialectic. It means that there are ideas engaging with each other since the beginning of human sort of questioning, since the beginning of language, and they will probably continue forever and ever. Excitedly, we get to be part of that story. And that's, for me, what makes doing ethics and being a human being so radically wild and exciting. It's that we actually get to grapple with these questions and we get to create the future, right? So that's why we have to resist complacency with doing things like considering. So what do I think about these sort of 4 sort of tensions or ways that science and religion are enemies? Well, I mean, I think that, so I'll take one step back and say, if you're in academics or you read people who talk about religion or you talk about science, or what you see is a lot of black and white thinking. And that is the other thing that I want us to resist tonight and forever into the future, which is to say that, I disagree with what that person says about that one small thing, and so nothing they say from here on after can be true. Or that statement is false and in every way, every formulation of it. No, some people say things I disagree with, and then they say a lot of other things I really strongly agree with, and that's why we can talk to each other and actually learn something. So we cannot demonize each other. I mean, you guys, we live in this politically charged world where it's just like you feel like everything you might say just could like turn into a typhoon, an explosion of anger from someone else. And so we have to we have to move past that and actually talk to each other. But so that, I'm just going to say a couple quick things about that history. First, the world of the Enlightenment, out of which the questions that Copernicus was grappling with, that Galileo was grappling with, that Darwin was grappling with, a century or 2 later. This was a world where everyone believed in God. So that's the strange thing. That's the thing we have to all take a step back from and realize is that it is a cultural fact that these people believed in God in a created world, one that was bestowed with laws that the human intellect could discover. And there's a lot of recent scholarship in the history of science showing that and trying to ask why. I mean, why didn't science emerge out of other cultures? Why did it emerge out of Western Europe in a particular period of time with a particular group of thinkers who were engaging reality in a particular way? Now, there are perhaps a lot of answers to that, but it is a historical fact that these were people who believed in God. People like Copernicus and Galileo and Descartes, all of the empiricist thinkers like John Locke and Spinoza, plus or minus, and Immanuel Kant, these people who were grappling with these questions about what is real and what is reality. In the background, they were the products of a religious culture. They weren't working with assumptions. So I think that's something we have to remember. And even when we today hear the language of rights, or we talk about dignity, or we talk about respect, we have to ask ourselves the question, whether we are religious or not, we are the children of Judeo-Christian thinking in America. And we are given the categories out of which we think. When we see human beings, even if we are atheists, we exist in a world where our language, our words, and our descriptions are given to us by our past. And that past, out of which science emerged, was a Judeo-Christian thinking group of people that were thinking in a certain way. And we're relying on a belief. This is what I think is really cool. The belief that the mind was created by God to be able to apprehend truth about reality. And for me, this is the ringer argument for why I cannot be an atheist. And it is because of this. If we look at evolution, we have to ask ourselves, what does evolution do? What is it for? What does it create? And just to make sure we all know that when Darwin put forth evolution, there were a lot of religious thinkers who adapted evolution into their various religious narratives. And the Catholic Church, from a very extremely early stage, worked with evolution and said, this is how God created human life. Like, there had to be a process. This is just the process. So, setting aside all the debate around evolution, let's say, though, that it happened in a way without any kind of intelligible direction, right? What happens? Well, Neanderthals ultimately, through the evolutionary process, emerge into human beings. Now, what can evolution produce in terms of a mind that can answer the question, there is or is not a God, truthfully? In fact, what even is truth and knowledge in a world where evolution was the engine that created all of you and me, and evolution alone? I cannot see, and if someone can answer this, please do, ask the question, how that process could create a mind that was tuned to answering the question, there is or is not a God. Because that is not what evolution does. Evolution creates material bodies, bags of atoms, that replicate better and more effectively than all the other bags of atoms. It does not care if these creatures that we are can say true or false things about God. So if you do not believe in God, I cannot understand how you could ever possibly believe yourself when you say there is no God. Because that's not what we can do. We cannot say there is no God unless, paradoxically, there is a God. I don't know, if we're following that argument, that's going to be a question. Good, I want it. And so if we are merely bags of material going through life, I do not believe that we can truthfully say there is or is not a God. To look back, there's a man named Jean Piaget, who was a child psychologist and theorist, and he posited the stages of development of children. I'm a pediatrician, so I study Piaget. And children, as many of you know, are pediatric nurses and other pediatricians in this room, go through stages of development. So when a child is very young, they don't know anything about object permanence. So you have a candy bar, or you have a dog, or you have a ball, and they see it, and then you move it behind a curtain, and for the child, it disappears. And do we judge that the child was somehow deficient? No, we say, you just don't have the machinery to know that the ball is real or is not. Why should we think, as more developed beings, that we have the machinery to say that God exists or not? Because just like the young, undeveloped child, we are merely smears of material that is going to be gone and entirely inconsequential in not too long. especially if we keep, burning fossil fuels and polluting the environment with carbon. And Lawrence Kohlberg, who is another child psychologist, posited something called the stages of moral development, right? So you can take the same argument about morality and say, he says when you're very young, you look at right and wrong in a certain kind of way. It's punishment or not. And as you get older, you eventually, when you're developed, learn to be able to say, oh, there are some human principles, right? Like equity or, the golden rule sort of situation. But again, those moral rules don't actually tell us anything about reality as is. They just are what we do, what we think, how we feel, right? So that kind of is in the backdrop of why I believe that having a mind that can actually decipher between truth and falsehoods about reality, about the material world, as a part of the material world, yet a being that can distinguish what is true and false, both in terms of objects and structures and also moral truths, requires there to be some kind of createdness, some kind of givenness, some kind of standard that we can be measured against. And again, this is something, right, that this debate has filled so many libraries across the world. And my best friend John, or one of my best friends, John, is a serious committed atheist. I don't think John is here. And I have learned more from discussing this and him interrogating me and me interrogating him than I have in probably reading any book by a religious writer. So again, in the spirit of this being a conversation, I feel like I kind of went off the rails on that one, but it's.
Let me bring us back.
I think it's really important,
Okay.
and it's critical for us to think about when we think about the mind, what we're up to when we think, and how we talk about these items.
Yeah, so the big question of that section was, well, that's the history of it, but has it proven itself out, and do we no longer need religious faith in order to keep moving forward? And as a person of faith myself and a pastor, I think the answer that you're telling me, and I think it to be true, is that it takes faith regardless of what kind of faith it is. We need faith to move forward. So if you think about what hope is this distant thing that we think we can get to, and faith is the fuel that gets us there. So it's the substance that leads towards the hope of what we believe we can do. And as I see it, people of faith, if you're thinking about religious faith or Christian faith or Jewish faith or the Muslim faith, have a faith and a promise of a God that will lead to the hope. Science is the same way. What we have learned so far, the evidence that we've gathered, provides in us the substance, which is our faith, that if we keep going in this way, we'll reach this future hope. And what I would say, and then we're going to ask our questions. What I would say is, when it comes to coming up with bioethical standards and norms and ethics in general, if we limit the kind of faith, the kind of fuel that we can put in our car to get us up over that mountain to that thing we hope in, if we limit that to one or the other, either just faith in a God or faith in science, we won't get all the way there. But actually, when we have, and I think as a Christian, I believe in the scientific method, and I have faith that leads to hope in the things that science and human minds can come up with. When we actually pair those together, the fuel that we have can take us much further than if we limit the fuel that we'll put in our tanks to one or the other. And so that's a question, what is faith, and how is it related to hope? And we'll get into that more in our final section. But right now I want to invite up my friend Jeff. Jeff's a great considerer, and he's got a little game for us, and he's going to explain it to us. And this is a different way of doing Q&A. Jeff, why don't you explain to them why we're doing it this way? What is this in your hand?
Well, this is just a way for us to get back down to earth here and play a little bingo, because my mind is blown right now, and nothing like a little bingo, huh? Just to light the mood. But what we decided to do, just have a little fun with our questions, is as Dave said and Dr. Tate said, this is really about conversation, your questions matter. And I love the idea of connection, that it's not just the ideas, but actually to have a human connection here is so important. And to be practice civility once again. So it's really cool.
And I'll just say, and one of my major goals is that everyone walks away from this night with a new friend that maybe they will hang out with later and actually talk about these things. That would be super dope.
Yeah. So I'll be anyone's friend that's still trying to figure out what was just said. Now I know why I'm not a doctor. But so here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna draw a couple numbers just for fun, and if your number's there, then you get to ask your question, and then we're just going to open it up to anybody. But the point is, some of you you'll look at your number on your card. Some of you may be like, I'm never the person that asks the questions, so we really want to pull out and just say, hey, you're valuable too. And if you say, hey, I want to pass, not me, that's totally cool, all right? Just say, we'll pass to the next one. So here we go.
So let me just add to that, Jeff. We'd love everyone.
Do you want me to help you hold
So
that?
part of considering is
Yeah, I might
learning how to ask
put it
a
on the
question. So we'd love everyone right now to just put a question down on one of those cards.
I'm gonna let you turn it, dude.
The chance here is a 2% chance that your number will get called, so very low. But then you'll have that card that you can take home with you. Let's see if it comes out. So write your question down on the card.
I think this is, oh, there we go.
Oh, there we
Oh,
go.
wasn't open. See,
Oh, there we go.
There we go.
Okay.
All right. We got a 27.
Hercules.
Anybody?
27.
27. All right.
Yes.
What's your question?
Yeah. Do you want to? Are you reading it or am I reading it?
You
You're-
got
you
it.
got it.
Yeah.
Reading it. Are there any data or research done on bioethics in the larger context of other world religions and how global scientific advance in the non-Western kind of idea?
Great question.
Well, let's give him a round of applause. That's a great question.
Yeah. Great question. Yes, absolutely. There is a rich and diverse. There's rich and diverse scholarship in interreligious dialogue surrounding bioethics. And for instance, I was just 2 weeks ago in Pittsburgh at American Society of Bioethics and Medical Humanities, and I went to a talk called Interreligious Examinations of Women's Rights from the perspective of bioethics. And there were some amazing scholars. One who is a Hindu scholar, a Hindu bioethicist and professor at Case Western, who presented how Hindu theories of embodiment and contamination in terms of cross-caste contamination can radically change how women think about surrogacy. So and also I think it's very important for people to say what they are experts at, and say what they are not. I am not an expert at Hindu bioethics or Hinduism. I would say I'm only an expert, in some dimensions of Christian theology, in Western bioethics, especially pediatric ethics, and in palliative care. But we all read widely, do our best. But so there are a lot of different conceptualizations. In fact, I very much think it is important to have the dominant Western conceptualizations of bioethics critiqued. And as a shout out, next year, 2021, there's a conference called the Conference on Medicine and Religion, which was birthed out of this conference called ASBH becoming too anti-religion and only working toward sort of promulgating ideas that were in a very strict Western mindset, right? What's the Western mindset? It's the Enlightenment happened. Rational beings are able to secure what is right and wrong through either utilitarianism, maximizing joy or happiness, and minimizing suffering and pain, right? That came out of a very specific, Anglophone tradition with John Stuart Mill and a guy named Jeremy Bentham, two philosophers, and that bloomed into Peter Singer and a lot of different ethicists you've heard of. And this guy, Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, a German philosopher, who said, well, no, it's not about maximizing happiness, minimizing suffering. Rationally, we don't need God, but rationally, we can think hard enough and we can figure out what we can or cannot do to each other, right? And so that's called deontology. It's rights-based. Well, who do you think was a major influence on the American sort of vision? Immanuel Kant, right? We hear rights language embedded in the Declaration of Independence, embedded in the Constitution, this idea that we can rationally sort of secure what is right and wrong due to each other. I say all that to say that is the dominant theme that has sort of, constructed how a lot of bioethics is thought about. And in the West, I do not think there is enough interreligious dialogue. Anyway, this conference on medicine and religion, which was birthed out of that, is coming to Portland, and I am on the planning committee. So we are going to be bringing in a whole host of religious thinkers to address how medicine and bioethics should comport itself, and that's going to be in March of 2021. I'm really excited about that. So there are a lot of other opportunities, and there are a lot of other thinkers who have different visions of reality. In bioethics, a classic question is, what do we make of decision-making when the family group does not see autonomy as we in hospitals see autonomy? So the sort of classic case is grandmother has cancer. Grandmother and family come from some Asian community, an Asian country, maybe they're refugees or immigrants, and they don't see autonomy and decision-making in the same way that we do, which is that I am in control of my body. What I say about my body is what goes, and no one else gets to have any determinations around that. But in a lot of Asian cultures, and this has changed a lot as the West has sort of encroached its dominion over the rest of the world, but decision-making doesn't work like that. Instead, the eldest son is the decision maker for his parents, and the parents don't even necessarily get to know what's going on, and that is, you have lots of stories about how this is either affirmed or actually when you really ask the grandmother, it's not affirmed, and so how in the hospital, many of us who work in hospitals have found this sort of challenge to be ever present in, do we respect people? What about when they say they want something under their body that we think is totally crazy? What about when they say, I want to commit suicide? And we say, you can do anything you want to your body except for that, I think, but maybe not. Because in Canada and in several countries in Europe, you can commit suicide because you do control your body, and doctors will help you to do that, right? So you're exactly right. Great question. I'm not an expert in other religious conceptualizations or scholarship in bioethics, but I think it's extremely important, and I try to engage with it as much as I can. That was a really long question. I answer. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But super important.
And I would just add to that, this gets to the whole idea of do we accept other streams of knowledge and wisdom if they disagree with us, or does might make right? And just because we think we're leading the way, that we have all the answers to these things, we might look at that and say that's so backwards, but is it backwards? And this gets to the same point that maybe we have blind spots, and maybe we should engage in dialogue and interact and let all streams of wisdom and knowledge. Maybe we don't have it all figured out.
Yeah.
And so that's the kind of humility rather than hubris that we want to be as a people. And I think, and that comes, for me, that's very much informed by my Christian faith in realizing that I am not the center of knowledge and wisdom. And so I have to be very open that God might reveal some knowledge and wisdom from something outside of my very Western,
through a different
autonomous
tradition,
thinking, through a different tradition, just to wake me up to the realization that, whoa, how did we get here? So, great question. Let's do one more.
We'll do one more here.
Okay.
All right.
Ooh, yeah. Okay. What do we got?
Let's see what we have here. Number 70. Anybody?
70. Okay,
Oh,
go again.
70's
Bummer.
not here.
70 missed out. Didn't exist.
All right. 58.
58.
Anybody?
You can always punt if you want to kick it back.
We'll do one more and then we'll open it up, okay? Here we go. 71.
I don't think we have that.
All right.
What's
so
happening?
maybe that's telling the bingo machine's telling us.
Yeah, I want to.
So hey, we're gonna open it up just
Okay.
for a
We'll do
couple
one
more
question.
questions.
How
One
much-
more.
Let's one or two, depending on how long it
Yeah.
takes. Yes. Do you want the mic?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Let me know if you can't hear my question. So I want to be respectful of the time, so I'll try to, I have a million things to say, right? You guys have been great. Have you had this much fun in a long time?
I so appreciate that.
Boy. So thank you for the freedom to do this, and I'm hoping this connects to some of you, but I'm very curious to know. You guys have both been very eloquent, but I'm not convinced still that there's any connection, that there's any validity to the faith component of this. Unless you talk about faith in science, which I kind of reject that usage, but as an anthropologist and a logical positivist, and I have to say, as a devout agnostic, I think the reasons you gave for not believing in atheism are precisely why I'm an agnostic. And my question's really that. I mean, I just have yet to be convinced. You can't just say, just by saying that, your notions of the mind and how do we evolve to a mind that can question the existence of God, I don't think that is sufficient. I don't see the connection. Please say more about it. That there is a God. Because I think there could be a lot of explanations for how the mind evolves, either in a Kantian way, or even my professor with Marvin Harris, who is a cultural materialist. So there's very similar kind of connection there. So I'm rambling, but I'm
That's
just
great.
really
I love it.
wondering- I do think it's important to consider faith, but I think that consideration is dangerous. And I think we need to be aware of that. I'd love to hear you both say more about it.
Just before we say that, I'd love to hear when you say could be dangerous. What do you tell me more? What you mean by dangerous?
Well, I just mean that anytime faith is relied upon in place of empirical evidence, then I don't trust it.
Yeah.
And I think that if it is truly what that, as Marx was saying, the opiate of the masses, and it's just, as an anthropologist and from all the cultures that I've studied, there's so many different variations of God. How can you say that any one of those exists, right? It's really more that humankind's need to explain things they can't explain. So I guess that's
Yeah.
what I mean.
Let me maybe I'll make a first remark. And let
I mean,
you
that is
formulate
the
your
question,
ideas.
right?
Yeah,
you
that's
pretty
the
much.
question.
I'm just gonna let you guys.
And
We
that might be, you can sit, Jeff, if you want. We'll flow into the next thing. Let me just clear this up for everyone. Okay?
That is the question.
Yeah, but I'll say this. And this is why we can't do just one bear and the butterfly. So you'll have a chance at the end on the blue card to write a topic that you'd love to discuss publicly.
And feel free to add a speaker that you would like to hear, because
yep.
we're gonna be thinking about who to bring in.
Yeah. But I would say this. I mean, this is a thought experiment that, of course, we can't go back and redo history. But let's just think: what would the world look like now had not at least the Christian notion of God, this God that's a rational God who has created things orderly, has created natural laws that we can understand with our rational minds because we can trust our minds because there is a God that is above and over it. Where would we be medically and scientifically had we not believed that? Had that not been the fuel, the faith that moved us towards this hope that we could actually have dominion over our world and create from it good things and reduce poverty and raise the average, as Steven Pinker would say, like there's lots of progress that has been made, and why has that been made? Can we go back in our minds somehow and wonder what would it be like? And of course it's so hard to relive that history and say, what if people hadn't started worshiping a Jewish carpenter who had died and apparently risen from the grave? What would our world look like? So hard to do that. The best that we could probably do is look to a culture who was not infected, so to speak, with Christianity right off the bat. So you look to a lot of Asian cultures and things that did not have Christianity influencing it. And the one thing that you notice that's different, they had much technological advancement that sort of paralleled the Western world, but that technology did not lead into areas of medicine and human flourishing. Their technology tended to stay in sort of technology for technology's sake. So a study of that, and so why do I say that? At the end of the day, it is faith. Faith is believing something that you cannot see, hoping in something that has not yet been achieved. But if we can go back and try to think about what our world would be like without a belief in this kind of God, has it led to a world in which, in some ways, we think is better than a world without? And so to get to this point now and then to strip that down and think that we will continue to head, that we'll have the fuel to say go where we think we can go without recognizing the historical impact of that first type of faith, those first scientists whose faith was really more of a faith in God, in a sense, than it was a faith in science, until science had built up the evidence, the track record, so to speak, so that we could have faith in it. That's an interesting thought experiment. That's not necessarily an answer. It's just something I think to think about, to frame how we try to understand how we got here, so that we don't get sort of muddled up in thinking that was not a part of it. And how much of it was a part of it, could we be still where we are today without it? Because that is part of what the faith is. And when I talk about this sort of faith cocktail, we should have faith in science. It's proven itself. There's evidence that it does work, that there are laws that we can understand. And
say belief in science.
Yeah, well, it's
So
belief.
How do you see
Yeah.
that as different?
Yeah, thanks for that.
You writing a poem over here? What are you doing?
I was thinking, I was going to collect my thoughts, and then I just didn't write anything. There are a lot of ways to think about your question. I'm not going to say answer it, because it may be to some extent unanswerable. I think, and this is an area where probably Dave and I disagree, or not disagree, but perhaps differ in how we think about religion and faith. Maybe we don't. I'm not sure. When it comes to ethics, I love that anthropology is part of the conversation around ethics, because I think what anthropology does is it recognizes that at any period, in human civilization, human history, there were built-in norms in a community. A community had its own norms, So you can look, religious studies as a discipline, in many ways, as I see it, anthropology. It is anthropology or sociology. So what does that mean? We look at different cultures over time and see how they built language around some vision of the sacred. What is sacred? What is worshipped? You're right. Marx saying that religion is the opium of the masses, he was recognizing that all humans worship something, and they always have. Actually, you know what? This is great. I wrote down a quote, or I underlined a quote from this book that I have read that is actually perfect for this exact question. This is a book by a theologian named David Bentley Hart, and he is answering this exact same question. So I'm going to read a little bit of what he says, and then I'm going to give you kind of my take on it. And honestly, if we talked about nothing else, I do think this is sort of a central question. But so he's talking, this guy David Bentley Hart, he's responding to a philosopher named Daniel Dennett. Daniel Dennett is one of, if you guys kind of have heard this, the four horsemen of atheism. So Samuel Harris, who has a podcast, Richard Dawkins, the ethologist, the biologist who wrote The God Delusion, Christopher Hitchens, who wrote Why God is Not Great, and Daniel Dennett. So this guy, he's responding to Daniel Dennett saying, religion is a natural phenomenon, you fools. Why would you ever put your trust in an anthropologically produced, sociologically constructed phenomenon that cannot tell us anything about reality, about transcendence? And so he responds, of course religion is a natural phenomenon. Who would be so foolish as to deny that? It is ubiquitous in human culture, obviously forms an essential element in the evolution of society, and has itself clearly evolved. Perhaps Dennett believes there are millions of sincere souls out there deeply committed to the proposition that religion, in the abstract, is a supernatural reality, but there are not. After all, it does not logically follow that simply because religion is natural, it cannot become a vehicle of divine truth, or that it is not in some sense oriented toward ultimate reality, as, according to Christian tradition, all natural things are. Moreover, and one would have thought Dennett might have, if you read this book, this guy is so just like vicious. I can almost not read him because he's so like dismissive of people, but he's very smart. And one would have thought Dennett might have noticed this. Religion in the abstract does not actually exist, right? And almost no one, apart from politicians, would profess any allegiance to it. Religion in the abstract. Rather, there are a great number of systems of belief and practice that, for the sake of convenience, we call religions, though they could scarcely differ more from one another, and very few of them depend upon some fanciful notion that religion itself is a miraculous exception to the rule of nature. Christians, for instance, are not, properly speaking, believers in religion. Rather, they believe in Jesus of Nazareth, crucified under Pontius Pilate, rose from the dead, and now, by the power of the Holy Spirit, present to his church as its Lord. This is a claim that is at once historical and spiritual, moral, artistic, philosophical, social, legal, and religious. As for religion as such, however, Christian thought has generally acknowledged that it is an impulse common to all societies, and that many of its manifestations are violent, superstitious, amoral, degrading, and false. The most one can say from a Christian perspective concerning human religion is that it gives ambiguous expression to what Christian tradition calls the natural desire for God, and as such represents a kind of natural openness to spiritual truth, revelation, or grace, as well as an occasion for any number of delusions, cruelties, and tyrannies. When, therefore, Dennett solemnly asks, as he does, whether religion is worthy of your loyalty, he poses a meaningless question, is what he says. For Christians, the pertinent question is whether Christ is worthy of loyalty, which is an entirely different matter. As for Dennett's amazing discovery that the natural desire for God is, in fact, a desire for God that is natural, it amounts to a revolution not of thought, only of syntax. So I agree with a lot of what he says. I think, and this is something that I struggle with myself in terms of how I think about the transcendent. It's kind of what I got from the beginning. I'm still trying to answer this question in some ways that you've posed. The way that I have come to see it is, as he says, and as C.S. Lewis would say in his essay, The Weight of Glory, it's surprising that we think that all natural desires have an object that fulfills the needs of that desire. When one has thirst, there is water. When one has when one has a desire for good food, there is good food. When one has a desire for sex, there is sex. All of these things exist in the natural world, and yet this one desire, which is a deep desire for union with our Maker, that is a total fabrication. And you might answer and say, well, yeah, because it helped us evolve, or Marx would say, helped us, it's our crutch. My answer is, why would you believe that? Like, why you say it and then somehow everyone's like, oh yes, of course. I see it just as likely that this is built into us by our Maker. But this is directly related to why I see science and faith interacting with each other. Because belief in science, in my opinion, requires faith. And so if you look at the history of science, it's one upheaval and then it's another upheaval. There is very famous philosopher whose now name is forgetting me, who wrote The Structures of Scientific Revolution. Thomas Kuhn. So Thomas Kuhn, thank you. Thomas Kuhn, he takes a sociological approach to science, and he says, essentially, science is not about discovery. Science is much more about creation. Science tells us a lot less about what is real, but it tells us a lot more about who we are. So, and he studies the history of science, and he shows that science will be having all these discoveries, but in reality, they're just repeating the same stale set of beliefs, and they are unable to actually say anything new because they're so stuck in what he calls these huge metaphors of cognition. And then it takes a real revolutionary to break out of that structure. And then guess what? You're on to the next structure. But who's to say that new structure is actually any more secured the truth about reality than the previous? And you just kind of go on and on and on. And you might say, well, what about Newton? We know the first, second, third law of thermodynamics are real. But then what did Einstein start showing us in the theory of relativity? That we actually don't know what is real, what is secure, right? And so who knows? And this again gets to my question of what can our puny minds actually know about reality? We weren't evolved to know true things about reality. We were evolved, if the Darwinian picture of human life is true, to just survive. Bare, meager survival. I mean, that's the story. That's all we got. So, but what happens when you posit that we have minds that can actually secure the truth about things? Then we start introducing the idea, as David Milley Hart would say, that yes, religion is of course a cultural embodied thing, just like hands are and love is. But that in no way logically says that some are true and some are false, maybe. Some are closer to the truth, closer to falsehood. That transcendence really can zap into our realities. They do these MRI studies. They've done them on Buddhist monks who meditate, and they've done on some Christian priests who pray. And disproving that God exists, they show that one spot of the brain lights up when an MRI, when they are in these deep meditative practices. This is what some of these atheist writers say. And my question, and others would say, is kind of in a similar vein. What does that prove or disprove about God? I am a body, like Christian tradition at least, and Jewish tradition is so clear that we are bodies. We're made of stuff. And that's how God works in the world and in our lives, is through our bodies. So of course a part of my brain would light up when I'm engaging in an interaction with transcendence, just like a different part of my brain lights up when I hug my child or think about candy. So, I don't have an answer to your question. I really don't. I grapple with your question. How is it that a body, a psychological process that has all these cognitive shortcuts that don't really make sense of the world, could actually then trust in God? But I would turn the question back around and say, if I have all these cognitive problems, why should I trust in anything? Certainly not science. If cognitive science is showing that human beings can't trust their reason, why in God's name should they trust their reason about cognitive science? And so this gets to me, what all of life is Dave doesn't like the leap of faith, but Kierkegaard's leap of faith. I have to leap into a belief that science is real, or I have to leap into a belief that God is real. Dave likes to say it's a small step. A little
I
nudge
will
into
grant
faith.
you, or a very large step, or jumping over a puddle. I don't know about this running towards a cliff and jumping. Maybe
Maybe it's not for you because you were born with more faith than me. I don't know.
No.
But
Maybe it's less the leap, more of the blind nature of faith. I think oftentimes religious faith is said to be blind, and science, faith in science or belief in science is said to be eyes wide open. And I would say Christian faith is eyes wide open, that there are evidences that point to the fact that there is a God, that actually having faith in God leads a culture or society or me as an individual towards a kind of flourishing in a life that is better than if I did not. And this is what's hard, to make a historical argument. And so one of the ways I feel like the only way to solve the problem or prove the point would be to allow a culture to live without a notion of God for an extended period of time and see what happens, or see what happens to bioethics, see what happens to science if we totally remove it. Because that's what we're fighting for, of not removing it, but actually, great bedfellows. What if we removed it?
Back to the point of this night.
Yeah, I mean, John Lennox, who's a great mathematician, he talks about that. He did a lot of work in the Soviet Union before it was opened up even, and he talks about, well, we do have a bit of a picture of what it looks like, a godless society, and the question is, did that turn out better? And you could say there's lots of other reasons why the Soviet Union turned out the way it is, but would we be following the evidence where it leads, using the scientific method to say that that society or culture is something that leads to more human flourishing than another culture that allows God and faith and religious faith to be a part of it? And so it's so hard.
Yeah.
But it isn't a blind faith, I guess is what I would say. That's where I always get on you. Is like, don't close your eyes and jump, Tyler. Open them up, and there's lots of evidence to show that we can tie lots of good things in human flourishing to a belief in God. And then I would say it's not just a belief generally in God, but there is something about the Christian God, the Judeo-Christian God, the God that's rational and given us rational minds and wants to interact with the world that he has created, and therefore he has revealed things to us that we wouldn't otherwise know if he hadn't revealed. And so if we follow in faith towards the hope that he's painted for us, that we might end up in a place that we never thought we could be because our minds are so limited. And when we do that, we end up in places like modern medicine. That's what I would say. We've ended up here thanks to God, like convincing us that we had the kind of minds that could end up here long before we ever thought we could cure a disease. Let's move on.
Well, we have...
What do we got?
We have 20 minutes.
20 minutes. Well,
and we were going to do just questions after this. So maybe we should take 5 more minutes and talk about our last...
Let's talk about our last topic.
Yeah. Flourishing.
Flourishing. So we've sort of touched on it. What is human flourishing? If the thesis that when we allow all streams of knowledge and wisdom to work together, that we might reach a type of human flourishing and common good that we couldn't otherwise reach if we siloed these streams of knowledge and made them work independently. But we got to understand what is human flourishing. So from your perspective, what is human flourishing? Do I need to put a timer on you?
No, I need to,
Okay.
I really want us to have time for questions, and I have to drive back to Portland tonight. So unfortunately, we have to end right at 8:30.
Okay.
So I'm not going to answer what human flourishing is.
Great.
Because that's such a huge question. But I will ask a couple of quick questions that I think I've been thinking about lately. And these are related to bioethics and actually related to this question about freedom and autonomy. So there's a philosopher named Robert Nozick. Robert Nozick is a famous libertarian philosopher who was at Harvard for many years. And he wrote in response to another philosopher named John Rawls. John Rawls is very famous for writing a book called A Theory of Justice that Bill Clinton used in thinking about a lot of how to sort of structure healthcare and other things in the 90s. What did Robert Nozick did a lot of things, but Robert Nozick introduced a thought experiment. This is called the pleasure machine or the experience machine. It's a lot like the Matrix if you really kind of think about it. So here's his question, and I think it's important for us when we think about human flourishing, suffering, union, all these things. He says, what if scientists invented a machine? And if you read Brave New World, you'll see the resemblance, where you could plug your brain into this machine and you would have nothing even slightly distressing or bad ever to think about again. You would just be awash with bliss in its sort of most just magnificent form, and you would really not think much, but you would just have pure, unadulterated happiness for the rest of your days. And what everyone sort of universally responds to is like, oh, no. Like, there's a grossed out feeling you have towards this. And what he argues is that rational beings would not choose to be plugged into this machine and never experience anything bad again. And he then therefore concludes that it is rational and therefore right to say that human flourishing or the human good requires some kind of badness or suffering or trouble or pain to be manifested in its fullest formulation. Okay, I don't know if that's right or wrong. I know I would not want to be plugged up to that machine. So, but I think that raises a really important question. And academically, one of the major things I write about and do research on is suffering. In ethics and in pediatric ethics, we oftentimes say that a child is suffering, a child who has profound neurological brain injury in the pediatric ICU. We say they're suffering because we're poking them, we're prodding them, or they're not suffering because they don't have a brain, they can't think and experience life. And what often comes from that is a decision to either let them die or keep them alive. In the Netherlands, there's something called the Groningen Protocol, which is a protocol that allows for the euthanasia, the killing of disabled children under the age of 2. And this is allowed, legally permissible in 4 situations, one of which is an impaired or disabled child who doctors and parents feel doesn't have a life that is worth living. So this is primarily in children who have holoproencephaly, so very sort of not a ton of brain, but not dying, requires support, and spina bifida, and various spinal cord disorders that cause them not to be able to walk, be very disabled. And in these parts of Europe, we kill these children, okay? So Mike, the question how does this relate to human flourishing? I believe that human flourishing requires the whole breadth of human experiences as we live them today. And I think about this a lot, and I said this when I briefly said this at Sideris, but when I read a novel or in my own relationships, the things that I think contribute to my own happiness and my flourishing is a richer kind of word than happiness, right? Is things like forgiveness or reconciliation or love or communion with another. However, what do we recognize when we start seeing how those words work in the world? Those words do not exist except as in the stark relief or in the wake of bad things. So forgiveness does not exist in our lives unless someone needs to be forgiven. Unless you've been wronged, you cannot forgive. Reconciliation doesn't exist between two people unless prior to reconciliation, what do you have? Estrangement. And the most amazing moral acts in our human history are all in response to suffering. Whether that's suffering from moral evil, like Nazi Germany, or in response to natural destruction and evil, like a tsunami or an earthquake or a flood. Does that mean that we want to have those things in our lives? Of course not. So if that's the response, that's a silly response, in my opinion. But what does it mean? It means that our conception of human flourishing requires things, experiences that only even make sense, are only intelligible in juxtaposition to bad things. So what does that mean for human flourishing?
Well, let me ask you.
Yes, ask.
Okay. It seems to me what you're saying then, that the idea of human flourishing as just the reducing suffering and increasing happiness, pleasure is not a great definition or a complete definition of what human flourishing
or a viable
should be,
definition.
or viable. And most of us sort of intuitively understand that actually the things that actually lead to flourishing are things like meaning and purpose and hope. And so whatever we allow into the conversations of bioethics, if we are saying bioethics should lead to life and flourishing, we should be able to bring in these categories. And so if our worldview or system of beliefs do not include those, we should just ask, is there any place we can get those from? Yeah. Because we all intuitively feel like those are the better part. Is that kind of what you're saying? Okay. Now let me ask you one final question, and then we'll go to your questions, because this is the question I really wanted to get to. When you're doing bioethics, palliative care, pediatrics, how does your faith, and I think most religious faith has this element in it, but how does your faith or hope in, actually is a better word, hope in life after death, how does that inform or change the way you do bioethics as you see it, palliative care as you see it, pediatrics, from maybe somebody who does not have that eschatological future hope of life after death? Because I know that we've talked about this. You believe in the resurrection.
Yeah. I'll just say it more in terms of my practice, because I think, in terms of, I'm a pediatric palliative care doctor. That is, I care for kids who have a life-limiting disorder and are going to die, for the most part, an early death. And it's a really hard question, because when I tell people oftentimes that I'm a pediatric palliative care doctor, they say one of two things. You can probably guess what those two things are. Whoa, you're kind of freak. You're a freak. Like, you want to just deal with suffering all day. Or, oh my gosh, you're an angel. I don't think I or anyone doing palliative care is either of those. Pediatric palliative care. So how does my faith help me do this work? Well, it really does. It helps me by realizing that I believe that we are promised nothing. We are not promised 90 long years of health, wealth, and happiness without any aches or pains. Cancer, Lou Gehrig's disease, ulcerative colitis, or disability. Because I believe all life is a gift from God, I see it as a treasure that we can hold in all of its formulations. And because I see flourishing and the good life as having both joy and suffering, it helps me to, I think, care for families who are experiencing that suffering. Because I think, when we did our last Bear and the Butterfly 2 years ago, I talked a lot about this guy, Stanley Cavell, and he says suffering is not something to be explained. It is merely to be described and then sat with. And because I have a hope that a child's short life is still a rich life, and one that will, just like all of us, end in union and love with God, I can see it as having lots of suffering, but also as a celebration, and as having beauty, right? Because what is an alternative presented to us in liberal democracies? It's that a life that can grow old enough to have preferences and select those preferences, make choices, and fulfill the full expression of my authenticity, right? That's a sort of a liberal worldview. That's really where flourishing is located. And what does that leave no room for? It leaves no room for broken bodies and broken stories. Stories that don't lift into an arc at the end of them, but instead it's a child that is born into suffering and dies with suffering. But the Christian story, at least, as I live in it, this narrative says that this isn't the end. There is a redemptive quality to our lives, and that, like Thomas Aquinas says, suffering can be borne because in suffering we have a recognition that the ultimate thing. So what is the human relief of suffering? It's in union, it's in friendship, it's in love. In love, you can absorb some of that suffering. And as I see it, that absorption of suffering in human relationship is just a reflection of the ultimate sort of union that God has waiting for us and is manifested in the world in physical reality in the person of Jesus Christ. So again, this is not me preaching, if it sounds like it, but it is sort of in a tradition and a worldview that can explain, that cannot explain, that can describe a reality where suffering makes sense.
Yeah, that's good. Some of you know my wife is a nurse at Seattle Children's Hospital on cardiac transplant, and so just reminded me, and I should bring up my wife because she's a beautiful woman in so many ways, but she's never more beautiful than when she loses a patient and she comes home, and how can that be? The love that she has in her heart for a child that's not her own and that she only spends a small percentage of her life with, but that she feels so deeply for. I can't explain that outside of the narrative that I believe by faith to be true, that actually, and this is what the Christian faith in particular teaches, is that the most glorious, beautiful moment in human history was a Jewish carpenter hanging from a Roman cross. It explains it when I see my wife's face when she comes home. And I hear that in you when you talk about that. And I don't know how you do it every day, because I fall apart when my wife comes home with just one of many stories, and you're feeling those stories. And I just want to say thank you for sharing with us, and we'll open it up for questions now. But I think that's why bioethics is important. We were talking about how did you end up where you are in bioethics, and we sort of came to an epiphany for you even today over lunch. Was like, I think you came here because you love science, and you love medicine, and you love the life of the mind. What was the other thing we said?
And religion.
And you love, you love your faith in Jesus, and you love hope, and hope eternal, and meaning and purpose, and you believe history is headed somewhere. And where does a person like that end up?
And you can
Pediatrics,
too.
palliative
Yeah.
care, and bioethics. So when you look at your own story, so thank you for giving us your time and for sharing with us. And now we'll open it up. We have just 7 more minutes. But
great.
we like to use a fullness.
Yeah.
Let's do, Jeff, you want to do one more?
You could try one more.
Let's do, this is a fantastic game here. Okay, let's
Come
go.
on.
Number 20.
Oh.
Number 20. Do we have a question from number 20? We want everybody to write their questions.
Oh,
yes.
Okay, number 20. Here we go.
This is from earlier in the conversation, but I was hoping that you'd be able to talk about how the medical schools address the history of trespass, the fact that the violation of human rights, we're learning about it in school.
Yeah, great question. It tries, but not enough, I would say. I've been thinking about this a lot. I am with this new position I have at OHSU. I'm teaching a course called Living with Life-Threatening Illness, and it's for 16 first-year medical students. It's an elective they take where for 9 weeks we tackle 9 different aspects of dying. It's sort of thinking about dying and the care of the dying. How can we do it well? The thing that I'm talking to them about, and this is where, the funny thing is I do medical ethics, and I hated all my ethics classes in med school, because when you're a medical student, you just have to, you always are thinking about a test. And what's the thing about an ethics question on a multiple choice test? You can always get it right without studying, because they're just so blatantly obviously, it's like do you lie to your patient, have a relationship with a patient, it's like, or tell the truth. It's like, tell the truth. So I don't think ethics, teaching medical students really about ethics is the way to go about it. The thing I've been thinking about lately is asking the question, why is medicine, why is healthcare any different than science, the thing we're talking about? And the reason is because it deals with bodies, but not just bodies. Bodies have stories. People are bodies. So that's why the humanities and religion and faith and understanding why we care about bodies and not trespassing bodies is so critical. And that's why I think the medicine, and people are trying to do this. I just came back from a workshop at Columbia on narrative medicine where people are doing this from the perspective of the humanities. But it's to say that nurses and doctors and PA and physician assistants and respiratory therapists, they're not dealing with material, they're dealing with human beings. And human beings are sacred. And human beings have stories. And so medicine, as we look into the future and we want to resist, how can medicine be a form of resistance against injustice? It can do so by starting, maybe medicine needs, 3 months of history, philosophy, and the humanities and film studies, right? That would be awesome. That's not going to happen, but maybe it does, because you can't learn all the science you need in medical school anyway, so you learn it all later. But you're evaluated on it in a way that acts as if, right? It's sort of like in medicine, in medical ethics, we call this the hidden curriculum. Lots of people write about this. The hidden curriculum. We don't say that you don't need to tell the truth to someone who you make a mistake toward, but that's how it's modeled. Because so when an attending physician makes a mistake and they don't tell the patient that a mistake was made in surgery, then the medical student sees that as the norm. And we talk about from an anthropological perspective, medicine has its own anthropology, and it's historically been one that doesn't tell the truth to patients. Even when it's written about by the philosophers, the doctors keep on not telling the truth. So from the perspective of virtue ethics, you need moral exemplars to do that. And so that's what I'm trying to do at OHSU, is change this culture. And lots of other people are too. But I think that it's not just doing another ethics tests. It's recognizing that medicine is not a PhD in physics. It's dealing with bodies and stories and human beings.
Yeah, and I think that's a good place to I wish we had more time for questions, but a good place to wrap up. And I know a lot of you are medical professionals, and if you're not, you're human beings, and you're dealing with other human beings, and bioethics will come up, and you can be that kind of exemplar in your profession, where you're asking the hard question when you're in the break room and people start talking about human beings as something other than persons with stories.
Mm-hmm.
Stop them. Say, no,
Yeah.
no, we are ethical people. Don't fall into that trap. Don't get lazy. Like, this is why we encourage each other, that we can make a difference in the way we talk about bioethics, whether we are a professor or whether we're a pastor or whether we're a nurse or a doctor or whether we are just a person living in a world who will engage in these kinds of conversations with family or friends. Like, we can allow wisdom and knowledge to flow into a place so that we can all be better. And remember, and this is where I struggle, that we don't get to decide what's a good story and what's a bad story. We don't get to evaluate that and say, a story, as short as it could be, as painful as it could be, or as long and as fruitful as it could be, there's value in that story, and I've got to account for that somehow. And I believe that to be true, and I think I would just encourage us all, whatever level we touch this and actually practice this out, bioethics, that we would remember that, and that we would be champions of that every human being has value and a story, and no story is without value. And so,
I'll just say the last thing is, when we think about ethics, just to challenge everyone, if someone says ethics is about what's right and wrong, it's not. Ethics is about how to live. And that's how it was always conceived of since Aristotle on, and then it got distorted in the last couple hundred years, and just trying to become a procedural activity. But ethics is about how we live and who we want to become. And that's the task that we all have as human beings.
well said, well said. Jeff, what do we need to know in closing?
All right. This has been good, huh? Yeah, let's give these guys a hand. Wow. I'm going to give you some final instructions, but Dave knows me. I got to say one thing. Yeah. I never put this together, but when I was in 6th grade, I went to India, and I visited the House of the Dying and the Destitute in Calcutta. I was 12 years old, and I met Mother Teresa. And I was a 6th grader, and I was wearing a Seahawks jersey, Steve Largent. And I have a picture with her, and I didn't register anything. I'm 6th grade. I was playing a Game Boy the whole time. But I think that encounter in that place where the ethic was taking the dying and the destitute, those that did not even culturally, societally, even religiously meet the standard, even for the hospitals to take, she took, and brought them in and saw them to the end. And it just, what you were just saying there, and all this gave a rational and a context for why that she did that, and why even in the crazy world we live in, that is still heralded as one of the greatest acts. Yep. And it just got me thinking that, we're having these conversations not just to get smarter, because I think the world is plenty smart, as Dave said, but how do we become better, gentler, more loving, and for the human flourishing. But wow, to have that, the wisdom and the insight and the intelligence behind that is incredible. So thank you guys. Let's give one more round of applause and I'll give you final instructions. All right. So, hey, we hope to do many more of these. So, first of all, leave your topic suggestion card on your seat. We want to hear from you. If you have any idea or topic, please put that down and put it on the seat. The second instruction is to take your 3 question cards with you and share it with a friend. So, we want you to encourage these conversations. And the questions you have, keep it up. And then I think that's it. Thank you for considering with us, and we'll hopefully see you at the next one. And bring a friend. We'll get a bigger venue because I'm sure more people are going to come. It's awesome. So, again, thanks for being here.